All right, everyone, welcome. Welcome back to Mongabay's webinar series for journalists. We're broadcasting to you live on YouTube and here in Zoom. Whether you're joining us here or on YouTube, thanks for coming. I just want to let you know that this entire webinar is going to be recorded, so don't worry if you miss any of it. You can always come back to it later. So today's webinar topic is going to be how to cover gender and the environment. And this is a really important topic. It's with lots of nuance, and we're obviously not going to be able to cover all of it today, but we will examine quite a lot over these 90 minutes. Things that include people's experiences of and responses to environmental change, climate change, access to land, resources, journalism itself, and participation in decision making. Before we get started, I just want to let you know that we are seeking stories on women in conservation, which Karen Coates will tell you more about. But if you want to pitch us a story after today, go to mongabay.org and click on the opportunities page, and then go to pitch Mongabay a story. And from there, follow the instructions, and you'll be able to pitch us from there. But we always encourage you to pitch your story idea to other outlets if you decide not to pitch it to us. So today, our expert panel includes Karen Coates, who is the fellowship editor here at Mongabay, and Omaira Bolaños, who is the director of gender justice at the Rights and Resource Initiative, and Ananya Chakraborty. She is a senior program research specialist and in climate resilience practice at WRI, the World Resources Institute, India. As in the past webinars, we're going to give each panelist an opportunity to address each question that we ask today. And then at the end of the webinar, we hold a roughly 15-minute Q&A session as time allows. So if you have a question during the webinar today, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A. I do recommend that you save your questions for the end, as sometimes a panelist may answer your question inadvertently through the session, but go ahead and drop it in the Q&A function and we'll address it at the end. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So our first question is as follows. Why is it important for journalists to understand and report on the connections between gender and the environment? Could you share a brief example from your work or from the latest research to help illustrate these connections? What are the essential terms and concepts that journalists should understand when reporting on gender and environment? And anyone is welcome to start us off.
Okay, I can go, if that is okay.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the invitation, and I will be talking from our perspective, from Rights and Resources Initiative that focus on the collective tenure rights of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local communities around the world. And we are leading the work on addressing women's tenure right within collective tenure systems. So that will be my perspective. And in terms of gender, I think one of the main points that we wanted to say is that environment issues, climate change, biodiversity are not as separate issues. They intersect with political, economic values, practices, and intersectional factors that define whose role is value, what roles are defined for women and men and other peoples in the community depends on, even though the diversity of identities and origins and perceptions. And I think even though women at the community level has been playing a key role in being stewards of the land, biodiversity, addressing and innovating in ways to address climate change effects in their communities, the role continue to be invisible and continue to be left behind in all decisions that are related to their own life, to their community, to their family, and to the environment, not only at the territorial level, national level, and international level. So for us, from my perspective, I think it's important that when journalists addresses issues of climate change and biodiversity, ask the question, who I need to talk to? It's not only left behind. So women should not be left behind and someone else should talk about her. about women, about how they feel and what they are doing. And I think many cases of addressing issues of climate change and biodiversity, what we started seeing is that the real voices of women are not there. So one of the issues to address is, when you go to communities, what is the right that those women have? Yeah, if you are addressing issues on that community, are they able to make decisions? Are they part of the groups that make the decisions? Are they having benefit from those resources that are being used? How they are being affected, and what are the different aspects that affect women? Normally, women are reported to be mostly affected by climate change and biodiversity loss, but we need to think about beyond that. Why women are reported to be the most affected? Is women weak? No, I think it's not weaknesses about women. Is what are the structural barriers, political issues, social issues, economic issues that define that women are left behind? What are those roles that affect women in more that define women? What are the roles, and therefore issues of climate change, biodiversity loss affect women in a different way. So I think we call journalists to go beyond the issues of what is affecting, what is the general issues, and ask directly women. I will say like that and pass the word to other colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may go next, and Omaira has actually made my work very, very easy. Thanks, Mongabay, for having me here. So I think I would like to start with unpacking the word gender first. So gender is a social construct. It is talking about, how the biological bodies of men, women, boys, and girls is dictated by social norms, cultural norms, expectations, and the roles that are assigned to these bodies. And these are contextual, these differ across the globe. Much of my work is based in India and within the South Asian context. And that's where I draw a lot of my experiences from. So here we see, for example, women do undertake a huge burden of unpaid care work. Globally as well, women are responsible for a lot of the unpaid and the care work that is performed. And things like climate change, things like biodiversity loss, rising pollution, do affect a lot of these roles that women are supposed to play traditionally, because they are women and girls. For example, things like cooking, cleaning, fetching water, fetching firewood for the family, making sure that there is enough food for the household. These are roles that women have traditionally played for a very long, long time and are expected to continue to play. And environmental degradation and climate change affect some of these very roles that women can or cannot do. And hence, it's really important to kind of unpack this concept of what gender means. The other point that I would really quickly like to bring in is the concept of intersectionality. Because when we talk about women, it's not that a climate event, an extreme climate event, or an environmental hazard is going to affect all women equally, right? It's often the women who are, sitting at the margins of multiple identities, say in the context of most of the global north, it would be things like race, economic position, education. In the context of countries like India, you have this additional layer of caste identities, indigenous identities in a lot of the countries across Latin America and in the African context as well, right? So these are additional layers that affect what women and girls can access, can do, cannot do, and contexts like climate change as threat multipliers, environmental degradation is a threat multiplier. And that's why journalists need to address a lot of these issues. They need to kind of make sure that we are not leaving these stories untold, because climate science, as it has developed, is often seen as a hard scientific kind of conversation. It's about the finances, it's about, who is paying and how much are we emitting and how much are we not emitting. But it's really to get into some of the real people who are affected, how are they affected, that journalists need to talk about why women, why girls, how men and women are being affected differently, perhaps through these same phenomena of climate change, like say heat waves or an air pollution event. I'll pause here and come back to it later. Thank you.
Well, thank you to my co-panelists. You've both done an excellent job of answering this question. And I just wanted to follow up by saying that from a journalistic perspective, the reason why we need to cover these things is that these questions I'm not seeing being answered generally in mainstream media in the sort of news that we're getting every day about climate change and environmental degradation. I'm not seeing so many reporters take those extra steps to ask the questions of how do gender roles specifically affect the outcomes. I think back to an experience I had many years ago in Timor-Leste, and I was in a very remote area in a mountainous village, and there was an extreme drought. It was terrible. The wells had gone dry, and the women and girls got up at 3 a.m. to take their buckets and walk miles to the nearest little stream that was still running. And they would wait there in line to just be able to bring back a few buckets of water back to the village. And by that time, the girls had already missed several hours of school. School had started and, they were behind. So where does that leave them in the future? I mean, these are long-term consequences that go beyond the environment and the family, but the entire future for women and girls. And there are so many examples like this around the world that we need to dig into.
Thank you very much, everyone, for those excellent answers. And Karen, actually, I'm going to direct this question to you because, speaking of needing to cover these stories more in mainstream media, we are, while we are an independent news outlet, we are actively accepting pitches on this subject. So can you briefly explain what kinds of stories are we looking for? And please also describe what kind of stories are not a fit for this type of pitching.
Yes, I'm very excited this year to have this new project on women in conservation. And actually, I think it should be more broadly considered gender in conservation or gender in environment, because we're not just talking about women, we're talking about all genders, and specifically how gender roles are a key factor in environmental issues and outcomes and what people experience. So what we're not looking for are stories of, say, women-led projects where it just happens to be women doing a project. That could work, but I would like to see, how is it that the fact that they are women, how does that affect the work they're doing? How does that affect the success or failure of the project? What sort of barriers are they facing in their community? How specifically is gender a key facet of that story? And another thing to consider if you're thinking about a story to pitch is, how would this story be different if this person were a different gender? I mean, does it factor in? If it doesn't, then it's probably not a story for this particular project. But if gender is critical to the article, to the story, then it is.
Great. Thank you very much, Karen. Because that was a Mongabay specific question, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. So climate change research shows that women and girls account for roughly 80% of people that are displaced by climate change, environmental degradation, and resource scarcity, and also face a higher risk of economic poverty, food insecurity, and gender-based violence. So what are the key reasons why climate change disproportionately affects women and girls, and what are the underreported aspects that deserve further investigation?
I can go first actually on this. So just following up on what I was saying previously, we do have a lot of research that talks about like women and girls being like, victims of climate change. and they are the ones who are most affected by climate change. And a lot of that is often, I believe, in my opinion, is the way in which we have framed a lot of these issues. Undoubtedly, women are the ones who bear significant brunt of climate change. They are the ones, because of things like social norms, gender roles, the ones that I was just mentioning, they're often seen as people who are affected the most because they can't do something. Just to give you perspective, during the tsunami that happened along the Indian Ocean in 2005, a lot of the women suffered because they were not taught crucial skills like climbing trees, or they wore clothes that were very cumbersome and they were not fit for purpose that they could swim when the tsunami came. Right? So identities and, the clothing, the roles that you can do, sometimes you are told not to go out. Girls and women are taught at a very young age not to go out. In India, there are practices like parda, or, practicing veil. So you don't go out and show your face in front of a family member. And during events like extreme heat events, or during events like climate disasters, these social norms often restrict or prohibit women from accessing some of the critical resources, some of the critical knowledge that can help them, cope with the disaster or survive them. And the risk to these disasters do not happen only during the event, but also are felt beyond the event when there are resources allocated. Often say, emergency response services sometimes is not really thinking about what are women's needs in some of these cases. Are women's issues like, say, having safe bathroom spaces, or say the example that Karen gave, like, our women's roles, like, making sure that they are the ones who are providing water supply, even during a drought or even during an extreme heat event. These remain unchanged, right? Even through some of these climate disasters. And that's how they kind of continue to remain like disproportionately affected. I really think that a lot of the focus also needs to reshift towards how women are also agents of climate change. So they are not of like, action against climate change. So they are not like victims, passive victims, but they are also coping in their own small ways, right? So women might perhaps not go alone, or they might form small collectives to address some of these issues. They also cope in their own unique ways. They're forming like, financial support groups with or without the help of the state and the civil society actors somehow. And I think these are stories that also need to be brought to the forefront. Women are learning new technologies. They are devising new knowledge. And they are constantly kind of, looking at the past, learning from their traditions, but also looking at the present, learning from like, say, this huge social media boom. And I will give you examples like the Khabar Lehriya movement in India, which is this group of journalist women working in Bundelkhand, which is one of the most drought-prone traditional rural areas of India that you can imagine. And these are women who are using digital media like, a phone and YouTube and their phone cameras to actually do great journalism on the ground. So I think it's also time to kind of shift the narrative from women as victims and passive recipients of climate change to like actors. And these are some of the things that journalists could really bring forward. I'll take a pause here.
I can add to the information. I think we can say that climate change does not create the inequalities, but the effects increases the existing inequalities that are already defined. And if we go back to the experience that we all had with the COVID pandemic, it seems that we're far away, but still we are experiencing the effects of that. At the community level, women have a key role in seed knowledge, medicinal knowledge, and what we experienced in the RRI coalition and the communities that were locked down by the pandemic, one of the main issues that we were receiving from our people was so how we respond and have food security. Yeah, when we cannot communicate to each other, pass information, pass food from one community to another. But that is sparked something that is very interesting, is that women became the center of recovering knowledge about seeds, food that were not using before because of the mainstreaming commercial issues of food that were brought to the community. But from that, several communities in Mesoamerica, women started recovering not only the seeds, but their own recipes that they were not using for several years. And they ended up providing and creating a new book for recipes for their own seeds and their own food. But these kind of things are kind of invisible to the media because they are too like normal for women cooking. Women, they say this, what is the news in that? But that it was key to sustain communities during a crisis, during a critical moment, and also help women at the community level develop a new line of local economy. So how we can make sure that journalists also knows about this, and when we address them, they don't tell us, because I had experienced that we call journalists, there is an issue. No, that is not so much important. If I cannot tie this to another issue that is very compromised by the community, how we can address that? I think it is also a call for general journalists and the mainstream media to deconstruct paradigms. What is conservation? Something that is corporative, is only done by big organizations, or is something that at the micro level, at the community level, that are doing at the everyday, ensuring that nature is there, providing the services that had normally provided by the relationship with the communities and the role that each member of the community play. So those kind of stories are important because in the future, what we are going to see is a lot of scarcity of resources and who has the knowledge at the community level. So we need to see that. We'll leave it that.
I think we can't overemphasize the importance of unpaid labor and the multiple roles that women have around the world, no matter the country you're talking about, no matter the society. I mean, women work outside the home, women have paid work, but they're also the caregivers. They're the people taking care of children and elders. And when there's a crisis, when there's an environmental disaster, when something goes wrong, when children or mothers, fathers get sick because of climate change effects, it's usually women who are taking care of that. And so I think, just to add on the excellent answers everybody else has already given, it's so important to look at how does a woman's role fit into that whole picture? I find in interviews that women are the ones saying, if there's extreme drought, if there's flooding, if there's, some sort of natural disaster, they're thinking about not only themselves and how to cope, but the entire family and the entire community and how to keep that community alive and how to build support systems to keep families alive and thriving. And so all of that factors into how women respond to environmental crises, and they're coming up with great answers that are not being reported and not being shared widely enough.
Thank you, everyone, for these excellent answers. And this is really quite, it piggybacks really well on the next, segues well into the next question that I had, which is on gender and conflict. But really, it could be about more than just that. I interviewed recently a writer who was writing about the impacts of oil in the Niger Delta. And what she told me is that women often function in peacekeeping roles during political instability. And this usually accompanies when men are turning to militancy in the absence of jobs or the degradation of their livelihoods because of environmental pollution and degradation. But meanwhile, the role women play in peacekeeping and their unpaid labor, which you have all described, is undervalued and goes ignored by the government itself. And then resources are funneled to men, sometimes, to send them abroad for job training that women already do for free. So when writing on a story on the connections between conflict, militancy, and environmental issues, what are the key questions journalists should be asking, and of whom? And how should journalists address safety and security in these contexts, both of the people they're interviewing and themselves?
Well, there's so much documentation of how climate change, how environmental degradation, conflict, all of these things intersect, and also the responses to them. So I was just reading a report out of Colombia about women environmental defenders and conflict, and how peace building is built into the work they're doing. So it's a seamless thing. There's so much overlap between seed saving and documenting environmental destruction and documenting violence happening in regions, while also building community kitchens, all of these things combined, because they all overlap. So from my perspective, in terms of the sorts of stories we're looking for, I'm interested in, if you're in a conflict area, or if the people you're interviewing are living in a conflict zone, who's in control of the natural resources? What's happening there? Who's selling them? Who's doing the mining? Who's doing, the deforestation? Where does that money go? What sort of effects does that leave for the people living there? And what are the women doing who are trying to work the land, grow food, find food and ways to feed their families and to keep their families alive? Or if they have to go deeper into the forest to find firewood because the forest is no longer there, what sort of risks are they facing on the trail? Are there threats of rape and kidnapping, the sorts of things that happen in conflict areas? So these are the sorts of questions I'd like to see more of.
Building on and Karen has shared, I think one of the key questions is who is being portrayed as legitimate to talk about the community. Yeah, often women and women's organizations at the community level, by the standard understanding, a Western understanding, is like they are not representing the community. Sometimes we faced that question by the own communities that are men-led organizations, or the donors, or the international communities. Are women really the ones that need to talk about the community? And the response is yes, they are. They are part of the community, they know, and they should be recognized as legitimate voice, as a right holder vis-a-vis other members of the community. Yeah? And that is critical in areas of conflict, because who you talk to and how the voice that you are listening are really heard and are really taken seriously. And I want to give an example of work that we have been supporting in Northern Cauca in Colombia. It's one of the major areas of internal armed conflict. And there is an organization that is called the Association of Afro-Descendant Women from the Northern Cauca, ASON, that has a great leaders, women that organize themselves because precisely the internal conflict, where their connections as a community, their food security, the systems that work that allow the community to survive and deal with these conflicts, they came together as women, organizing the rest of the community, working not only as land defenders, but restoring their own systems. Yeah. The relationship with nature, but the nature that has a function not only to preserve and set aside, but it's nature that provides the spiritual value, that provides their food, that provides the relationship among communities, and through that develop a series of connections on local economies and women's innovation. And one time we were trying to do video with journalists in that area. And there was before a lot of conversation with the journalists that were going to do there. And we were trying to emphasize that the voice of these women are important based on their community, but there were certain issues that we should not talk because of the conflict and risk that they have. But there was a lot of tension with the journalists because I wanted to talk about political issues affecting the communities and how they are perceived by the government. I say, can you just focus on what they are doing on the ground, saving their communities, bringing innovation? But sometimes the idea of reporting in something needs to be tied to the government perspective, that sometimes that make a lot of risk for communities on the ground, and women especially, that they are perceived as leaders, political leaders, leading the communities and issues. So I think we need to, as I said before, separate and paradigms of what is conservation, who can talk, how a topic becomes important for the media and for the broader audiences. We are, I think, as all of us as audiences of the mainstream, and we are bombarded by ideas that big issues, calamities, crisis is what they need to talk to us and know what are the issues on the ground that are supporting communities and how women are playing a role on that.
I have very limited experience on this, so I will sit this one out, but just wanted to add this one point. I am a researcher by training, and one of the first things that as researchers, as qualitative researchers, we are taught is document silences. So do not hear like the loudest voices in the room only, but also observe and hear who speaks, who does not speak, who cannot speak, who's prohibited from speaking. And I'm assuming a lot of these will really be important, even in documenting and reporting on some of the conflict areas. I'll take a pause here.
Mike, if I could just add to part of your original question was about safety and security. And I just wanted to note about Mongabay that we have certain protocols, we have certain procedures in place when any reporter is going to the field reporting in a risky situation. So we have an entire safety committee, and we have risk assessments that reporters going to the field fill out before they do any sort of travel. And editors and reporters work closely together to come up with a plan for staying in contact, for keeping the reporter safe, for keeping sources safe, for communicating when communication might be extremely difficult or monitored or surveilled. And then coming up with plans too, in case something goes wrong. So check-in times. If a reporter doesn't check in at a certain time, what's the next step? Who are the emergency contacts? Safe words to use if a reporter can't talk freely but needs to convey a message. All of these things should be considered before reporters are going into conflict zones or any sort of, risky situation.
Thank you, everyone. This next question is, what are the links between sexual and reproductive health and rights and environmental outcomes? And how does this change in countries with different legal protections for these rights? What are some key ethical considerations for journalists when reporting on these issues?
So there are connections between sexual and reproductive health and rights and environmental outcomes. There are cases, research on places where women have these rights and these rights are secured by law, or they have access to the sorts of reproductive health care they need, when women have the ability to determine when and how many children to have, if you take it a few steps further, there are improvements in deforestation, for example. So if SRHR increases in a region, it's quite possible that deforestation will decrease because there is less pressure on the land immediately. But also it opens up opportunities for women to do other forms of work, paid labor versus just feeding the family, going to the forest to collect firewood, make charcoal, those sorts of tasks. And on the flip side too, if we look at climate change effects, if women don't have access to the sorts of reproductive health care they need, if there's a flood, if the road is impassable, if they can't get to a clinic, if they can't get, the medication they need, so on and so forth, that has consequences in the other direction down the road for themselves, for their families, and for the environment.
I can come in on this from the climate change angle. So as all of you might have heard, like India in April this year, 94 of the top 100 hottest areas were in India. So India has been, due to the El Nino, India has been seeing like this unprecedented heat waves. And now it's spread across much of Europe and other parts of the world as well. There's really a lot of scientific research that has been going on how, say, events like heat waves or events like floods affect women's bodies, affect their sexual and reproductive health. And like, for example, there's a lot of new evidence coming out right now saying that extreme heat waves can affect fetal development. It can lead to early childbirths, women are not able, their bodies, especially poorer women living in areas with limited ventilation, limited access to cooling resources, are not able to address a lot of the rising heat. Events like pregnancy, like menstruation, change the hormonal balances within women's body and, changes how women kind of address and tolerate heat differently than men, because men do not menstruate every month. So I think a lot of these kind of, newer topics are emerging, and there's science that has been talking about building out some of these evidences, but there's very little kind of, awareness around a lot of these issues, because I think what journalism does is brings a lot of these stories to the forefront. It has the ability and the capacity to amplify some of the research that has been done. And it's really important to kind of, bring some of these stories to the forefront. The other case in point is, say, menstrual health and hygiene during post-disasters like floods or cyclones or tsunamis, when women are sitting in, these shared cyclone shelters, or after they are evacuated after floods. And often the conditions in which, a lot of people are kept together in cramped conditions makes it really difficult for, young women, young girls to access menstrual hygiene and care during these periods. And there have been certain really good articles that I was able to find where it spoke about the lived experiences of being a woman during in some of these shelter and rescue camps. Women could not access menstrual hygiene products like sanitary napkins, and they were forced to use dirty clothes. They did not have places to dispose of a lot of these use menstrual products. And I think what journalism also does is create the ability to, like, properly reported. You can also create it's almost like a pressure group that's showing and reflecting on a lot of these realities, which are otherwise missed out in the meta narrative of, rehabilitation after flood, or offering assistance after a cyclone or a tsunami. And I think these are things that journalists can really do very well. They are very well poised to do some of these stories, but that also means going and asking some of these difficult questions, overlooked questions, thinking about, women's bodies as menstruating bodies, as pregnant bodies, as bodies that are breastfeeding and caregiving at the same time. So I'll take a pause here, but yeah, these are some of the things that we could also think of within the broader spectrum of reproductive and sexual health.
I think I just want to say, just to conclude the great information, is that journalists should examine whether women can have access to services, safety, and whether environmental policies allows that for them to have services or restrict them. And also from the ethical perspective, I think should protect privacy in general, avoiding stigmatizing women more than they are currently, and especially careful when you are reporting for countries where some reproductive, gender, or sexual orientations are not defined as a right, and are criminalized and heavily restricted. So I think we need to, as journalists and interaction with communities, understand the context where they are, and how building a story can help to become visible and talk to the rights, or make them more in a risky position, place them in a risky position. So the issues that we need to consider. And I highly recommend that, because sometimes it's not just the topic and it's well received by the broader audience, but what that means for the people on the ground, that should be considered.
Thank you very much, everyone. We talked about briefly in that last session about how heat impacts health, but how do different forms of pollution, such as like plastics or pesticides or air pollution, affect the health of women and girls specifically? And what are some of the pressing and emerging issues around pollution and women's health that deserve more attention from journalists?
I can actually comment on that, like living in one of the most polluted cities in the world. I am based out of Delhi, and we are like really, we rank among one of the most polluted areas. I do not work a lot around air pollution, but my organization has been doing some really good work around this. I think, like, especially in terms of, say, pollutions like air pollution, there is a lot of like evidence that some of the roles that women perform, say like cooking, cleaning, sometimes in very cramped spaces within the houses which do not have ventilation, further puts them at the risk of air pollution. Women, especially from marginalized backgrounds, from low-income groups, who often have caused the least contribution to air pollutions, like they do not own vehicles, they do not own, they do not take flights, they do not cause any of these air pollutions, but they are often like, the most at the receiving end of some of these effects of things like air pollution, and it affects their health, their breathing, the lives that they lead. But these are often not really documented. Just out of experience, the recent Iran, US-Israel conflict that led to choking of the Strait of Hormuz caused this unseen ripple within Indian households. Most of us do not use electricity for cooking. We cook using LPG cylinders, that is liquefied petroleum gas, like LPG. And that was not available in supply. Even now, the prices of LPG have risen, like considerably gone up. And the effect of that is that a lot of women who had come to use these LPG cylinders for cooking, they had switched from unclean biomass and firewood, which they had been using for centuries. Now they had over the past, 10, 15 years, due to the efforts of the government, they were able to switch on to cleaner fuels, had to again go back and kind of fall back on firewood and cow dung as their main source of cooking. Were these stories kind of documented, narrated? Not as much. So it would be really important to kind of, even in these contexts, think of how a macro event like the war cause rising air pollution in women's kitchens and how that affects their health. So I think some of these things need to be documented better, especially among low and middle income households who often do not cause a lot of some of these issues. I'll pause here.
I think this question too is connected to the previous question in that whether we're talking about heavy metals and toxins or plastics, PFAS, all of the above, these things can have dramatic effects on women's reproductive health, prenatal health, fetal health, birth defects, these sorts of issues. So, for example, there's so many products that women use or need to use, menstrual products. There was an issue a couple of years ago. It came out that a wide range of menstrual products contained PFAS. So when you consider that these are things that we are putting into or close to our bodies every month, endocrine disruptors in shampoos and soaps and the things that we use on a daily basis, all of these can have long-term effects on a woman's health, but also the health of her children.
I think we also need to address this from the perspective of power, yeah, in a broader sense. It's who has the power to prevent, yeah, and to make the policy decisions, and if women are part of that, decisions in terms of regarding policies preventing pollution from all types. But as Karen was saying, I think we place all of us as individuals in a world that is full of plastic, that is, or sometimes if you see your app about the weather, you see the air quality is very bad today, and sometimes you don't know. But I live, for example, in the middle of the forest in upstate New York. And sometimes the app says bad quality, but I am thinking, from where? I came to live in the middle of the forest to maintain my air quality. But I received information that is, where is that coming from? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, but we all as individuals, I think we need to start asking the questions and what is the power that we had to make decision? What is this affecting me? And sometimes we came with no options. Everything that you buy is in plastic. And if you want to have a better quality of life and not to be in plastic, you have to pay more. Are you able to do that? So just imagine how that affects other people that has less income, that live in another way. But if you go to rural areas in different parts of the world, many of the rural areas are contaminated by plastic. How communities has been imposed that everything that they do and they buy is in plastic, and there is no way to process and to and what to do with all this plastic after you use it one time. What is the major responsibility in the community, in each of us, in the big decision makers, in the companies? I think all those questions needs to be, and the whole chain that they produce in affecting people, women, children, men, people of different, everybody. So how we can address that issues of power decision making and how we address that in the early lives.
Thank you very much, panelists. We have about 25 minutes before we are going to start our audience Q&A, and we do have about 6 or 7 more questions to get through. So this next one is about environmental defenders. So women around the world are defending nature and their communities and their territories against destructive industries such as fossil fuel extraction, mining, monoculture plantations. although environmental defenders in general are already heavily targeted, women defenders face specific threats that include online harassment, sexual and gender-based violence, and internalized misogyny. So, what should journalists know about these specific threats and risk factors, and how can they report on them sensitively and with the necessary protections for survivors?
I think in answer to this question, I'll get back to some of the things I said earlier about just generally speaking, overall safety and security procedures at Mongabay in terms of reporting, and extending that to sources as well. So if we're talking about interviewing people who are at risk or in threatening situations, we go through the same process. Editors working with reporters and, determining a plan as best we can to protect people's identities, to protect the people in the entire situation of reporting out a story like that. And I think yeah, I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, I can add. I think, Mike, you in your framework question, you already said that women are experiencing more violence when they are land defenders, or they're defending the communities or the resources. And I think as journalists, I think it should be important to ask before the crisis, before who was leading what work, and for what women are taking the front line to defend their environment and their lands and their communities. What is happening? What is the source of that mobilization of women to be at the front line, and then to receiving even more violence against women, only from their own community, but from the state, from the private sector, from other actors that are there. And what is the effect of that? So I think it is a check background of what is sourcing this situation and how women are placed in that. And as Karen said, I think in reporting and addressing these issues, we need to be careful on how women and members of the communities are placed. In reporting on that, what is the angle that you need to address to make that issue visible, but at the same time protecting the life and interests of that community regarding their land and their rights to live in a safe environment, healthy environment. And it's all issues of ethics also. And the protocols that Karen mentioned before, I think community themselves have protocol on how to interact with journalists, or how to interact with external actors that need to be ask if they exist, and how do you address them, how you follow them, and work with communities in a way that are really, and also, as I said at the beginning, when you address communities that are defending their lands, also talk directly to women as well as you talk to other members of the community, and understand why they're taking the whole risk to be at the front when they have limitations at the community level, national level, but they are there. What is the importance of those issues to address?
Yeah, I think I'll sit this one out. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. This next question has to do with impacts on the gender expansive, non-binary, and also queer communities. So gender and identity and sexual orientation are, gender identity and sexual orientation are another dimension for journalists to consider. So how do these show up in your respective areas of work on gender and environmental change? How can journalists report on this effectively and safely, especially in contexts where gender and sexual diversity rights are not well recognized or perhaps actively under threat?
So I can actually comment on this. I had done some work around gender identities and sexual orientations for this other project, not with my current organization, but one thing that people need to be really, like as journalists, people need to be really aware of is that they might not be at the forefront of the people who are talking to you, who are, they are experiencing an event, they are organizing as a community, but they might not always be most visible if there are often like threats to being called out, to being, identified, and if countries and locations where you're working in do not openly support non-binary gender identities. I think in these contexts, it's really important for journalists, or in my context, researchers, to recognize that is there consent to share their identities when we are reporting? How do we ensure that we are not causing any further harm by disclosing their locations, their identities? And I think this also speaks quite well to the previous question that I skipped, like, is the participant who I am interviewing, is the person who I'm talking to, are they okay to sharing their identities? If not, can there be ways in which I do not disclose their identities but still share the story? I think those are some of the most important things that people could consider while reporting on such cases.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely critical to understand the local context and the consequences of what you're reporting. If you're a journalist talking to people in these communities, what happens after you leave? What happens after the story comes out? What are the consequences of you being seen with a person, and what are they facing after you've gone away? In journalism, we talk about trauma-informed reporting. And there again, I mean, it's similar to some other types of risks that reporters and sources face in the field. But, being able to establish a very broad sense of trust, making the source feel open and comfortable with you, but also understanding that, if they don't want to talk or don't feel comfortable or can't, that we need, as a reporter, we need to recognize that. We need to allow them to stop. And they also need to have a very clear understanding of our process, because a lot of sources don't. If they've not had a lot of experience talking to reporters, they don't necessarily understand terms like on the record, off the record, background, those sorts of things. So we shouldn't be using them, or we should be clearly explaining what we're doing, our process, what our intentions are.
Yeah, and if I may just comment on this, and I think this is also about the previous one, speak in a language that the community understands. We often have this, like we all as trained researchers or trained journalists think in English, we write in English, but please translate, use the local language as far as possible. Make it easy for the community to understand. Do not be vague about what you intend to do with the data, what you intend to do with the photos. I mean, these are really important as well.
Just as a way to conclude, I think as Karen and Ananya are saying, is safety is more important than visibility. So journalists need to be aware of that. And as already said, should never disclose identities or names or locations of communities if there is a risk on doing that. And it's important to have a clear consent, not only to have an interview and record perspective, but also it's clear explaining to the person or the community how this information is going to be used, what is the audience? It's going beyond the community, the countries, the national, and what that possible exposure that gives. So sometimes, and I say this because sometimes we ask consents on the communities to record information, and people say yes because they think they have a trust with you and that you are going to use it, but that is a public information. We need to go beyond and explaining what are the possible consequences of that before people give you consent, that are really aware of what it means to expose beyond their communities and their countries certain information.
Thank you very much, everyone, for those excellent answers. So, Omaira, this question is for you. So, among indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities around the world, women are often the caretakers of ancestral and local languages, knowledge, and practices. So, Omaira, can you share one or two brief examples of how women from these communities are uniquely contributing to environmental protection, conservation, and restoration? And what are some underreported stories that you think deserve more attention from journalists?
Thank you. I think I wanted to share two cases. One is from the Embera community in Panama, Amariet community local organization that is led by women. And we are currently working with them, but their story goes back to 1975 when their community was displaced by a development project, the electric plant in the Bolaños River. So they were relocated, the whole community, to another area in Panama. And with all the consequences of being displaced, lost your land, lost your connection to the nature, lost the knowledge that is placed in that area, the community were able to kind of reconstruct their own systems in another area. And much of that was based on the leadership that women were forming with the communities to bring back the knowledge, to be able to rescue some of the seeds, to bring it from the previous place to the new one, and recreate that territory as an ancestral land anyway, because they will able to nurture and to bring back that information. And they are now working in several lines of women's economic empowerment and women political leadership. That is very unique and important. And so there are two women in there that are for me, that is I have them like a symbol of power and women leadership. And one of them is Sarah Omi. You might heard of that. She has been recorded by the Forbes journal as one of the most powerful women in Mesoamerica. And it's because of the leadership as a young women leader in the community, to bring the community back to a sense that they reconstruct and have their process. Her mother also, that is Omaira Casamar, has been developing a long line of support for young women to pass leadership, intergenerational leadership, and all that is in relationship to restore and work in their new lands, in the new forest, to restore the local economies and their knowledge. I think these kind of stories are very good to rescue what is the process and continue process passing to women, to young women, and how that also benefits the whole community. There is another story about in Peru that I wanted to share. This is one of the organizations that is called Ananya, the National Organizations of Andean and Amazon Indigenous Women. They are women organized from different sectors of the country that came together to rescue their role as a political leaders at the national level, and has brought in a lot of change in the way women are perceived as a political leader at the national and international level. But they have been working in several lines, and we had recorded that and produced some videos that I will share later at the end in the chat. But they are working in something that rescued, they call in Spanish, ojos de agua. I don't know. It's like the spring of water, and the Andean level and in the lowlands. through the knowledge that women has in relationship with the water. Water as a core and fundamental natural resource that is connected to the rest of the other resources where community develop their own systems for local economies, for food security, and also for decision making, and how connections with the water are important for defining the whole system of knowledge. I think those experiences and how through that process of preserving water, women has been like a waving leadership through the whole community with young women, but also bringing men and young men to be part of the process. That's one of the issues that I think is important to address. And also because this kind of experience are ways for women to innovate in climate change mitigation. So how do you protect water? Because it's essential for the life of everybody and for the environment itself and the wildlife, etc. I think are issues that are important to address.
Thank you very much, Omaira. We've got about a little bit less than 8 minutes left here, and just 3 questions remaining. So this one has to do with women in leadership positions. So research shows that women in political leadership positions have led to reduced deforestation, reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So for example, in India, women in political leadership correlated with reduced crop fires and cleaner air. So what are some other examples from your work about women in political and other leadership positions positively influencing environmental change? And what kinds of questions should journalists be asking when approaching these stories?
If I may come in, so I think India has this like really rich history of women's collectives. We have a long history of the feminist movement and then the eco-feminist movements. And what a lot of these feminist movements have been able to do is collectivize poor women, rural women, marginalized working class women across a lot of issues around not only around their wages, livelihoods, but these groups, these women's collectives are now also talking and addressing things like climate change. For example, in Rajasthan, we have the Barefoot College, which is this excellent example of how rural women with very, very limited literacy are learning how to be solar technicians. And this has now been scaled and exported, this model, to other countries, including the Zanzibar Islands as the Solar Mama projects. We have the SEVA, which is a federation and a women's collectives working on informal women in Gujarat. And we have the Mahila Housing Trust, which is looking at women collective as leaders, community leaders, often operating out of slum and low-income neighborhoods, where these women collectives are leading change within their organization. They are the ones who are going and raising awareness about events like heat risks, flood risks. They are the ones going and providing new technologies like cool roof paints that can address climate risks like rising heat within some of these communities. And I think journalists can really go in and look at some of these. I mean, there are millions of examples across India. I just named a few because India has this really, really rich history of collectivization of women. I think journalists can go dig deeper into understanding how women have been leading a lot of these change, often under very, very difficult and limited resource constraints. What is the change that they are seeing as a result of this, and what more can be done, and how can they be better resourced, better supported, and how can their actions be, multiplied, and kind of how that can help shape and learn, help others to learn from their collective efforts within their small communities. I'll pause here.
If I can add, we are, since 4 years ago, supporting the creation and establishment of a Women in Global South Alliance network. It's called WICSA, Women in Global South Alliance, and it's a network of indigenous, Afro-descendant, and local community women from Africa, Asia, and Latin America that united in a common goal. Yeah, it's an informal platform, but it's devoted to two things. First, do advocacy at the international level to claim for the recognition of women as a right holder. So in all scenarios, especially at the different ecosystems for global funding on climate change and conservation. And second, to advocate for direct funding to women's organizations that are if you see the data at the international level, first, there is very little, and second, whatever information is to funding for women, so women from indigenous or descendant is very limited. So the Women in Global South Alliance has evolved. First, they have been developing some research on what is the funding that is really reaching women on the ground. As you know, from the two pledges of the climate change and the recent one in Brazil, there has been a lot of commitments from several donors, from philanthropists, bilaterals, and other international organizations to help channel funding to communities that are preserving the world. But the big question that we asked 4 years ago is that really reaching women on the ground? So instead of following the funding from above, so we are reviewing with the WICSA, what is the funding that is really reaching those women's organizations that are at the front line? The results I can share later, but the results are saying it's very little, yeah? And most of the work that women are doing in climate change and conservation are free labor. Yeah, so that accumulates to the structural barriers and conditions that women doing volunteer work for everything, and they have recorded that. But the other amazing thing that just recently happened is, as WICSA wants to make systemic changes at the international labor architectures and relationship between international community and women working on the ground, so they decided we need to change internally, yeah, because we all are part of a system that is hierarchical, establish power relationship, differentiate between people depends on their origin, identities, places and things. So they just recently created a horizontal co-governance system that is circular, that places everybody at the same level and define that even WICSA holds women that are so powerful outside, like at the case of Sarah that I just mentioned, powerful women. Another that has been presidential advisor or occupied very highly positions. When they come to WICSA, they are equals. So they define the equality among women so we can change and inspire others to change. And I think this balance of representation and voice and giving value to each one at the same level, no matter where you come from, what is your status, what is economic power, education, are issues that also can inspire other organizations. We will be sharing that information, but I think that is a way to show how women are going beyond, women from the communities, in terms of defining pathways for equality and equal voice of women at all levels. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one small detail. So at the moment, I'm very excited to be editing several stories about women in leadership positions, running programs that are working. And there's one story that's coming out this week. I don't want to say too much about it because it's not out yet, but it's about a land restoration project run by women, but the project extends beyond that. It goes into micro loan programs and micro enterprises and ways for women to make money and save money and on and on and on. And the men in the community looked at this and said, wow, this is really cool. This is working. We want to join. We want to be part of this group. So it's an amazing little insight into how these sorts of initiatives go beyond women.
Great, thank you. We are at the time where we should be doing a Q&A. There is one last question I think that we must address, and it's for you, Karen. So, Karen, can you please describe the ways in which the subject that we've been discussing impacts the reporters who work on these stories? So what are the barriers and the challenges that women face when reporting on these stories, and how can newsrooms support them better?
This is such a big question, and I could talk forever about this, but I'm just going to put out a few keynotes. So globally, it's about 20% of all newsroom leadership positions are with women. So when you consider that, when you consider who is in charge of media and news outlets, and it's primarily men, how does that affect story angles? How does that affect reporters who want to do these sorts of stories? What does that mean for the stories that never make it? And then, opening up an entirely different can of worms, looking at the risks that women face in the field, cultural contexts, women not being able to travel safely, places where women have to be accompanied by men, places where, on the flip side, talking to sources, it's hard to find women's sources to speak at times. I've had the experience in the past. My husband is a journalist. We would report together often. I would ask a question, and the men would answer for the women, and they would answer to my husband and not me. So these sorts of barriers are the things that women journalists face constantly. And then you can get into also the kinds of harassment and violence threats, whether they're physical or online, and the lack of support that many women report, not having from their newsrooms. So it is helpful if newsrooms publicly stand up for reporters working on critical environmental stories. It is helpful when newsrooms publicly stand up for environmental journalists, and we're just not seeing enough of that. But there's so much ground to cover here. It's a whole different topic.
Thank you so much, Karen. We did have one more question. It's more of a general big picture question. Perhaps we can come back to that at the end. I want to get to some audience questions. So this is an interesting question. So what kind of story topics are most viable for coastal areas where cyclones affect women? In Bangladesh's coast, we're affected by cyclones every year. This comes from someone asking from Bangladesh.
I think, if I may respond to this, Bangladesh has been affected by coastal, like cyclones, and India also shares the same coastline. So we also kind of sometimes experience these cyclones along with Bangladesh. And there are multiple things that you could cover here. One is you could look at how these cyclones are affecting women differently. How do men and women have the same experience of cyclones? But what you could also do is, what are women doing to mitigate the effects of cyclones? I know, for example, the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove that India and Bangladesh share. It's the largest mangrove in the world. There is some marvelous work going on, like, restoration efforts and conservation efforts around the Sundarbans. The communities living around these coastal regions have their livelihoods dependent on these coasts. They are often fishing communities. They practice, like, small scale agriculture. Their livelihoods are being threatened by climate change, by environmental degradation, by saltwater intrusion onto their farms. And these are like tons of issues where you could showcase, understand, and explore, are these effects being felt equally by men and women within the community? Is it affecting, are the responses that men and women have to these climate risks, like the climate risk being cyclone, are they different? I think those are some of the responses that I would have that you could really explore. Also, questions about funding, like who's been funding. There's like a lot of effort, finances that's been going towards some of these efforts, and you could also look at if the funding is equitable, who is able to take part of it, is it reaching the ones who need it the most? Yeah, and can they effectively utilize it?
Great. Thank you, Ananya. I'm going to queue up the next question here. So this person actually had two questions. I'm going to stick with the first one for now. So it said, we've heard about how women leaders are driving change to address environmental challenges. Could you kindly share some success stories or practical examples of how good environmental journalism has contributed to positive change? I think it's a really good question.
I actually wanted to bring this up earlier too. In addressing this question, not focusing on a specific example, but I think it's also important to consider when we're looking at success stories and women's leadership stories, also asking the tougher questions of what didn't work or what challenges did you face? What did you learn in the process? What went wrong? Because I think that those sorts of stories can contribute the most to overall positive change. Because if we just have, and this, this gets into the whole idea of solutions reporting. If we're just covering, a happy story of this thing worked, then we're not really learning about what the learning process was and what other groups and other regions can take from that so that they don't repeat the same mistakes or that they draw different insights and shape them to their local context. So really digging into the tougher questions.
Did anyone have anything to add on to that? No? So this is a good question. It says, how can women's grassroots organizations cope with climate change actions when funds are being cut? This was pointed out in an R&R study.
I think first, I think grassroots women's organizations and at the level of the community are already doing a lot of things. And as we had been saying here, and is reported in different, women are not sufficiently supported. And I think there is an idea that women is just a victim. But reporting and making clear that women is also a leader, and mainly a leader, driving changes at the local level and making possible life even in the most difficult conditions are important. I think getting close to those realities and making possible that they receive the funding, that they receive the attention, technical support is important. Reporting on them, that's why making them visible with their own voice and trajectories, understanding the context where they are coming from is very key. There is in the work that we do, we face a lot of initiatives that are driven by women's ideas that support their own communities, the entire communities, not only serve women as such. And that is one of the qualities of women work, that is not only serving to themselves, but serving the whole community where they belong to and others. And I think those are the issues that need to be addressed, recorded with their own voices. From women, from the diversity of voices that also pertain to indigenous, Afro-descendant, local communities, and other type of communities that are on the ground. I just recently was in Kenya with the Pastoral Women Council, that is one of the pastoral women's organizations that work in Tanzania and Kenya. We visited some of their work that they are doing at the ground level. And they had something that is marvelous, interesting, that is called the Bicobas Village Community Banks that have been developed for quite a while. But it's a way, an initiative grounded in women's own initiative to support their own families and their own communities that had helped them to develop banks. And through that, local bands managed by their own system, has been developed a whole industry around milk. And where the women, I just learning that the cows are owned by men, but the milk is owned by women. So normally before women, milk didn't have that value because it was only for internal consumption. But through developing the Bikoba and the women's empowerment, they are empowering the whole communities, and now they have a whole industry in supporting the local economy of the county by the whole network of solidarity that they had established and connections to the women's empowered to economic development and empower community. For me, that's kind of the issues that we need to put at the front, demonstrate that it's possible, but that they need a lot of support, technical, financial, and surrounding those experiences because are important for everybody.
Thank you very much, Omaira. So our last question, just to wrap this all up, and thank you, audience, for your questions. That's about all the time we have for. My last question to the panel is, in summary, what are the most important takeaways from this webinar that you want journalists to remember when reporting on gender and environmental change?
Talk to women and listen. I think a lot of reporters talk too much and don't listen enough, but really, really ask women. Talk to them about their daily lives.
I can go next, and I think it's about understanding that all women are not sitting equally. So please be considerate of the intersectional vulnerabilities. Please talk to not only the woman you find first, but make those efforts to, find the woman who's most affected, who's most likely to be at risk, and please make efforts to talk to her. Be safe, but yeah, make sure that you kind of ensure that you document her voice and you hear her voice.
I will say that understand that gender is not an isolated and a apart issue. It's embedded in every aspect of the life of communities and ourselves, and distinguish also who talks and how they talk and what are the power relations behind that, because that affects how also who talks and how you talk. And also work with communities and the effort that they are doing without romanticizing them. There are also patterns of inequalities and process that need to be addressed to understand that are embedded on gender and other political and social relationships that exist on the ground, and portray a true story. Yeah, a complete story, not only a piece.
Well, that concludes our webinar for tonight. And I just want to say it was a privilege hosting you all. Thank you so much for joining and giving your excellent expertise on this very important topic and providing in an informative discussion. To our audience, thank you for joining. And if you want to learn more about this topic or other ones that are related, please go to Mongabay or find the information that I'll hyperlink in the show notes after this webinar is edited and uploaded on YouTube, which will occur within about 24 to 48 hours from now. Again, if you missed any of this, don't worry, it's going to live on YouTube in perpetuity. So you'll be able to cycle back to it and navigate it with the timestamps, and you'll be able to find all the information linked in the show notes as well. If you want to watch our webinar series again, I encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to our webinar newsletter, which we have by going to mongabay.com. Find the button that says newsletter on the upper right-hand side of the page. There will be options to select various newsletters. One of them is for webinars, and that's how you can find out when we're going to plan another one. But you can also just follow us here on YouTube as we are releasing more of these webinars in the future, or follow us on Threads, Mastodon, and Blue Sky, where we post announcements in advance. So thank you all for joining. That concludes our webinar today. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.